Hello, this is a presentation meant to introduce post-colonial studies. It is an introduction meant to introduce the meaning of postcolonial, the concerns of post-colonial studies, and as the title shows, post, it is a prefix means after. However, the area doesn't only deal with what is after, but it deals with the range of periods, the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial. And as an area, it is mainly concerned with the consequences of the historical encounter between the West and the non-West, the colonizers and the colonized. And it is a long history, and it is an encounter between two spheres, two cultures, two way of thinking, two and so on. It is concerned also with the power relations underlying such an encounter, and also the representations and the misrepresentations and the stereotypes that the dominant Western gaze fabricated on the non-Western others. So we have the idea of superiority of a dominant Western culture and the inferiority of a non-Western otherness. Also, this area of study is concerned with the efforts made by the previously colonized subject, societies and culture in order to regain voice and mark presence. So after a long period of colonization, I mean here not only physical colonization, but also cultural, intellectual, linguistic. So those people who have been previously colonized are now making an effort to find a place in the world. And the different ways, also it is concerned with the different ways the subordinate, subjugated, and subaltern colonized voices write back so as to subvert the traditional power relations between the West and the others. The way it asks question, the ways to subvert the traditional power relations predominant throughout centuries. So this postcolonialism is concerned also with the body of writings that endorse the presence of otherness in the face of Western cultural hegemony. So very important, these are some of the main concerns. And if I have to sum up these concerns, is that those previously colonized subjects are trying to make a voice of their own in response to the historical and cultural subjugation of their presence. Colonial encounters, if I go back to the past, the colonial encounters, it took time, it's long ago. And you can see that after the Dark Ages, there were scientific and geographic explorations. And you can guess that by 1492, we have the discovery of America, and it is a significant sign of the beginning of exploration and finding other areas, other places. And you can imagine that before discovering these people and these places, you can imagine the way people imagine the others. And from that time, Europe's interest in Africa was for centuries. And the 16th century, the Portuguese gained control of the slave trade and trade of gold to Europe. So you can see slavery and richness. Beginning of European expansions in the world, and much of Africa was unexplored until 1880s. And you can guess that the exploration of Africa was late, though it was close to Europe, because they have negative or wrong ideas about Africa, that it was dwelt by beings who are different from them, and because of race. And race explored other imagination, other forms of imagination, which made Africa not explored until in the 19th century. And the European influence was simply restrict to the coastline, fear of the dark continent. 19th century is the ideal, and it is the moment of colonialism, and it is colonialism means political control of one country over another, economic dominance, and it is also the process wherein colonizers impose their religion, language, economics, and other cultural practices on the indigenous peoples. So you can see that colonialism is not only territory, ruling territory, it is also economic, pursuit of interests, benefit from the sources, but also it is inculcating other ideas, other culture, other religion, other language, because they thought that the others were without culture, without religion, without language. So they thought wrongly that they have come to do these things. And colonization here is the process of establishing foreign control over target territories. And these Westerners were forming minority, governing, dominating majority of population. And it is associated with the colonial period starting from 15th century, when some European countries start to establish their empire. Also, religion, very key term here, because it is dealt with Christian missionaries, and the missionaries were organizing themselves to spread Christianity to new converts, believing that the others, the non-Western, the African, didn't have their religion, and their missions is that involve sending individuals and groups across boundaries, most commonly geographical boundaries, to carry evangelism and other activities such as education or hospital work. Also, apart from missionaries, we have the civilizing mission, to civilize the other. One of the ideologies that were fabricated by Western superiority, starting from ancient times, and so, but it reached its highest points with the Enlightenment, when the Western sphere thought that they have possessed the Logos, thinking that the Logos is the reason, mind, and think that they have the light while the other is living in the dark. And we have this belief that we want to civilize the other. However, when we see the other that they don't know, and the fear is that this other is that they have their religion, they have their cultures, they have their language. The only problem is that they were unknown. And so they thought that they need civilization, while it is wrong. And to civilize the other, the non-civilization, that is the barbarian, was put as an ideology expressing Western supremacy, and it is a pretext to intervene militarily and to colonize the other, because they thought they want to facilitate modernization and westernizing of indigenous people. So it means that we have to eradicate others in order to put our civilization, which is wrong. It is also a way of absorbing foreign people. It is also destroying the cultures, imposing of non-indigenous imperial colonial languages on the colonized people. So we can say it's not only economic, but also it is religious, it is cultural, it is ideological, and also it is trying to eradicate the languages. So the exclusion of any indigenous language from administrative and any public use. And colonization exercised what I can call glottophagy, that is to say, killing the language of the others in order to make their language supreme with these indigenous people. And that's a very complex issue. When we talk about postcolonialism, we find that writers of the postcolonial area were educated in Western schools with the language of the other, and when they are awake and they want to write back, they are put into the dilemma of the language you have to write about. And they say that this is the language that we have been educated in, and this is the only tool I have used. And the irony of postcolonialism is that they are trying to free themselves from the legacy of colonialism, but they find themselves writing in the language of the powerful countries. 19th century also insists on this century because it is period of European imperialism, European industrialization, such a rush to explore and dominate the African continent. So it is economic, raw material, mineral resources. We know that, for example, Africa, rich with minerals, cheap labor, access to market, invest capital. So it is commercial. And the 19th century is very important also because it is in West African Conference in Berlin, November 1845, where we have the idea of the Scramble for Africa. It is a moment when the European countries started put themselves and organize themselves in order to divide the cake. And it is to divide the cake of Africa, and because of struggle of interest in this virgin land. And the European colonial powers established their law and order over large areas of the continent. As I said, they introduced different modern ideas, education, government, and economics. And the Scramble prevented the formation of unified national spirit necessary to start a new independent country. And the idea was to divide and rule, which is an ideology fabricated again by colonialism in order to rule the country. And that's one of the negative consequences in Africa. Even nowadays, we have the fight between ethnic groups. And you can remember, for example, in 1930, in Morocco, for example, the Daher Berberi, where the French wanted to divide the Berbers and the Arabs. And this ideology didn't work. So unifying the hope of people was there, but colonialism fought against this. Also, the legacy of the colonists is left, in the oppression of economy Africa, which is left after that, crippled the regions of Africa. Schools were established here, and some African students attend universities abroad. And this is a problem, though they have been taught in the language of the other, the education of the others were transferred to Europe, and they come back as hybrid means. Also, colonizers built railroads, but the trucks ran not south to carry raw material to ports. After these periods of colonization, from ancient times, especially in 19th century, where we have economic, cultural, ideological, linguistic struggle, the Africans struggled to get their independence, and the 1960s were periods of independence in many African countries, a period of decolonization, especially, as I said, in the second half of the 20th century. We had anti-colonial movements, declaimed independence, regaining terror, but the impact of colonialism on Indian culture continued. The independence, of course, the consequences were devastating. Nationalist movement. Also, decolonization here displayed political instability, economic disaster, and debt dependence. As I said here, the consequences were disastrous in Africa, politically, economically, and also on the level of culture. And political independence did not bring economic independence because African countries continued to export agricultural and mineral products to their former rulers, and profits of trade and manufactures were not invested in Africa. So that's why Africa continued to be divided as a sequel of the colonial presence. And after these periods, I come to postcolonialism. After the independence, postcolonialism as an area of study, an academic area of study, it is a critical academic study of the cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And you can see the consequences of this legacy. And it focuses on the human consequences of control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. It is also a critical theory concerned with the analysis of the history, culture, literature, and discourse of European imperial power. And there is a body of texts and literature, and they often address the problem and consequence of the decolonization of country. And these questions relate to the political and cultural independence of formerly subjugated people and themes such as racism and colonialism. So if I have to define postcolonialism, it is a range of literary theory that has evolved around the subject. It also encompasses a wide variety of approaches and theoreticians, and they may not always agree on a common set of definitions. And mainly, such postcolonialism examines the social and political power relations that sustain colonialism and neocolonialism, including the social and political and cultural narratives surrounding the colonizing and the colonized. We are also always at the heart of relationship between colonizer and colonized, and the power relations that are standing there between the two. And also, postcolonialism is that examine the effects of colonial rule on various fields. If I say that postcolonialism examines the impact of the encounter, some important figures are associated with postcolonial studies, and I cannot find but start with this famous figure from Franz Fanon, and his idea of subjugation is very important in his famous book, The Wretched of the Earth, Les Damnés de la Terre, he wrote in 1961. And in this book, he examined the nature of colonialism as essentially destructive. And Franz Fanon thought that colonial identity was subjugated and it was harmful to the mental health of the native people who were subjugated in colonies. And the essence of colonialism is the systematic denial of all attributes of humanity of the colonized people. That is to say, there is a method, a systematic method of dehumanizing the colonized people. That is to say, exercising physical and mental violence. And that is to say, the colonialists tended to inculcate survival mentality upon the natives to resist colonial subjugation. That's why Franz Fanon calls for violent resistance. What is attained by violence should retrieved by violence. So he says that this violent resistance is cathartic and could free the native psyche and restore self-respect to the subjugated. So Franz Fanon was looking for violent resistance in order to recuperate what is lost. In his book also, Black Skins and White Mask, he said that the logic of colonial from the perspective of racial subjectivity, and that is, the colonialism tries to rule every aspect of the colonized people and the reality. And he focused on the problem of language and said that to speak a language is to adopt a civilization and to participate in the word of that language. And find that colonial beings are forced to adopt and speak an imposed language which is not their own. And they adopt and participate in the word and civilizing of the colonized. And they eliminate other expressive forms in order to reflect the word of the colonizer. You see that here, that the colonizer is alienated, the colonizer is alienated, oppressed, and he doesn't find a way to express his freedom. Edward Said, another important figure, in his famous book Orientalism, which I will come back to, wrote in 1978, a very important book on the relationship between we and the others, binary social relation with which Western Europe divided the world into the Occident and the Orient. Long ago, the discovery of the other was based on stereotypes on false cultural representation and degenerated discrimination between we, the West, and the create the other. Always we sense the enlightenment, we possess logic, reason, and the other do not. And this is the binary oppression here. And the other is always associated with the Orient, the Occident, superiority, the Orient, inferiority, and the irrational, rational versus the irrational. It is an ideology. That's what Edward Said is tackling in his book. And this idea of Orientalism allowed Europeans to suppress the people of the Middle East from expressing and representing themselves and their cultures. And they reduced the non-Western into the homogeneous cultural unity known as the East. So you can see that the paradigm allowed European scholars to represent the Oriental world as inferior and backward, irrational, wild, as opposed to the Western Europe, superior and progressive, rational and civil. And this is from past until nowadays, and it traversed science, literature, filmmaking, mass media, news, and in every aspect of the European way of expressing themselves, they represent themselves as superior to the other. So it is always the opposite of the Oriental other. So orientalizing the other, it is the wrong strategies to control the other, and that's what one of the things that Edward Said has tried to put as a pioneer of postcolonial studies. The other representative figure in this area is Gayatri Spivak and his famous work on the subaltern, and her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? After this dominant imperial ideology while the other is negated, is it possible for the subaltern to speak? And who is the subaltern? And according to Spivak, the subaltern is everything that has limited or no access to the cultural imperialism is subaltern, a space of difference. There is no room for difference. And it describes the lower classes, and the other displays to the margins of society. In an imperial colony, the subaltern is a native man or a woman without human agency. Impossible to speak while there is, how can I speak when I don't speak in my language, when I use the language of the other? So many people want to claim subalternity, and they are within the hegemonic discourse, wanting a piece of the pie and not being allowed. So they cannot be allowed to have access to this hegemonic discourse. And how, according to Spivak, how could these subalterns speak when they use the hegemonic discourse, when they use the language of the other? So, according to, they should not call themselves subaltern. The subaltern cannot speak, and knowledge is never innocent, and it always, according to her, expresses the interest of its producers. So, the subaltern remains in the field of the margin, and he was subject to what she calls epistemic violence. And this epistemic violence means violence exerted against or through knowledge. And one of the elements in any process of domination is this exercise of power over knowledge. And this epistemic violence means the destruction of non-Western ways of perceiving the world, resulting in dominance of Western ways of perceiving the world. So you can see that epistemic violence here allows the superiority of the Western world to dominate the others, and it is exercised through filtering knowledge, through education, language, and the new values. And the colonial power's destruction of her culture pushed, that is, women to the social margin, non-Western ways of perceiving and understanding and knowing the world. The other figure of postcolonial studies is Homi Bhabha. So if I see with Franz Fanon subjugation, with Edward Said Orientalism, with Spivak subaltern, with Homi Bhabha, the concept of hybridity. And in his book, The Location of Culture, 1994, he exposes this element, which is that the human world was separate, composed of separate unequal cultures, and it perpetuates the belief in the existence of imaginary people and places, Christendom, Islamic world, first world, second world, and the third one, so on. And it is reductionist. We reduce the human world into separate cultures, while cultures has often informed other culture. Throughout history, culture is not unique, but it has been informed by other sources, and other sources have developed. And to counter such reductionism, postcoloniality established the philosophical value of hybrid intellectual spaces. All cultures are hybrid. They have married each other, and they have contributed to the production of new ways of thinking and believing. And hybridity, according to Homi Bhabha, is the philosophic condition that most challenges the ideological validity of colonialism. So, if you like, hybridity opposes to the idea of the purity of culture. No culture is pure, no identity is pure. All cultures or identities are hybrid. That is the outcome of a lot of sources that have traversed human beings, cultures, spaces. The last example of these representative figures that critics Bill Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin in their critical book, The Empire Writes Back. And in this book, which is mainly pedagogical here, it's written by those people who formerly colonized by Britain and other European powers, and they try to explain the way post-colonial studies manifest themselves in their questioning of the assumption on which the study of English is based, the potential of subversion and exploring anti-imperialism, and the need for the empire to write back to a center. That is to say, coming back to the idea of the subjugated being, the subaltern, to find a way to express himself or herself in front of the hegemony of the Western culture. Also, postcolonialism, according to these writers, deals with the weight of the past, as it continues to dominate cultural production in much of the post-colonial world, and especially language, the medium. The problem of language is very intricate in post-colonial studies here. And if I have to sum up these points here, is that some of the cultures were displaced. Post-colonial studies and writings tried to replace, to find a place in the world. They were dislocated. Now, post-colonial writers are trying to relocate themselves in the world, and they tried to disempower these cultures and these areas in the colonial period. Now, these people, these post-colonial subjects, are trying to empower themselves. So it is a moment, if I have to sum up post-colonialism, it is a moment when the post-colonial subject try to replace, to relocate, and to empower themselves in the face of the cultural hegemony. The imperial, also, post-colonialism deals with the imperial expansion, that it has radical destability and an effect on its preoccupations and power, and the margin conceives of experience, culture, and truth, and centered, pluralistic, and multifarious. Again, the post-colonial writings try to introduce plurality and to decenter the centrality of the ideology of empire. That is to say, a place in the world. Also, it introduces the plurality of ways of conceiving of reality. And it brings into mind that, as an example, the African continent will find that it has its own languages, its own culture, its way of thinking, and that's what these post-colonial tries to introduce in their own writings. And introducing this is to find a legitimate place as an other within the hegemonic center. Also, they are going to endorse the richness of local culture and include them within the universality of knowledge. As a conclusion, I can say that postcolonial discourse seeks to question the discourses of power. And I have in mind the power of the empire, the power of colonizers, the power of the ideology of colonizer, to subvert the dynamics of power relations, superior, inferior, and try to find from the margins in the center, though it is difficult, to reinstate the marginalized in the face of the dominant, to invert the structure of domination, substituting the subaltern tradition in place of Western-dominated culture. In other words, the postcolonial discourse is a means to the theorists wants to find this subjectivity in a world of domination.